be great.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is one of our very special platforms in the International Humanistic Management Association with Sandra Waddock, the Intellectual Shaman Forum. So happy to see everyone. I know folks may be coming in as we get going. We'll put some information in the chat as we go. Please use the chat for your Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to Sandra, who's at Boston College, to introduce our conversational folks today to talk about a lot of important topics that I think Sandra will preview a bit further. But Jasper, Kenter, and Kate Pickett, welcome, warm welcome, and again, warm welcome to everyone for this International Humanistic Management Association event. Sandra.
Thanks, Erica. So welcome, everyone. I am actually thrilled to introduce Jasper Kenter and Kate Pickett today. I was privileged enough to be part of a team that Jasper put together, a global team that worked on the paper we're going to hear a little bit about. It's called 10 Principles for Transforming Economics. It's a little bit ambitious. And with Jasper's persistence, we were finally able to get it published in Nature Sustainability. So Jasper is professorial research fellow in deliberative ecological economics, and I'm not sure I can pronounce this name, at Aberystwyth Business School. Is that right, Jasper? Aberystwyth Business School, that's in Wales, an honorary fellow of the University of York. He led the GANE team, the Global Assessment for a New Economics team, which is what we're going to hear about today. And his broader work focuses on developing novel frameworks for assessing the values of nature. And he's published quite a lot on that, including a new paper on biodiversity values that is, I think, very important as well, as the one we're going to hear about today. And many of his ideas have been accepted by global bodies, including the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Kate Pickett is professor of epidemiology at the University of York, where she leads the Public Health and Society Research Group, the York Cost of Living Research Group, and born in Bradford Center for Social Change. She is the co-author with Richard Wilkinson of the best-selling and award-winning book, The Spirit Level, and also The Inner Level, which are really great books on equity if you're interested in that. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Jasper, who will be followed by Kate. And as Erica indicated, please put your questions for the speakers in the chat, and I will take note of them and call on you after to unmute yourself and ask your question. But it's great if we know what the questions are a little bit. So Jasper, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Erica, and thanks everyone. Great to be here. So I'm just going to stick my slides up. So I'm going to be talking about the paper that Sandra announced, which was part of a global project called the Global Assessment for New Economics, or GANE. And in this paper published in Nature Sustainability, we focused on developing 10 principles for transforming economics, drawing on all sorts of different new economics approaches that were in one way or the other focused towards human and planetary well-being rather than kind of affluence and efficiency, as you might think of in conventional economic terms. So I'm going to lay that out a little bit today. And the context in which we wrote this paper, it took years to publish because it was very difficult to get through some kind of gatekeeping issues in different journals. And I'm going to talk about those kind of intellectual lock-in effects a little bit more in the talk. But it was originally developed in the context of a global crisis, the pandemic. But then increasingly, really, we contextualize our work in terms of the polycrisis. So, you know, we are in a global polycrisis, a set of interlocking global crises, global political conflict, global wildlife population collapses. Something's gone the wrong way around with the with the animations. Also a human development crisis. So what you should actually see behind this wildlife population graph is a massive drop in the Human Development Index as a result of the pandemic that we really haven't recovered from. And then, of course, the global climate crises. And there are many other crises that we can mention. Now, as an ecological economist, I kind of do want to highlight in particular that ecological crisis, because even though we sometimes call it an ecological emergency, because it is more difficult to capture the ecological emergency in a single metric, although the WWF have tried here with the Live and Planet Index, where we can see that 68% of worldwide vertebrate populations, at least those that we monitor, have a collapse of 68% in abundance, and this is in 2016. It's gone down to 73% now. But it is much harder for people to conceive this than a simple kind of temperature change along a graph. And so for me, still, it feels like this ecological crisis is under highlighted. Even though 50% of global gross domestic product depends on high functioning ecosystems. And this is recognized by things like reinsurance companies, but hasn't gotten traction enough yet throughout the economy. And there's also major implications of ecosystem collapse for things like food security, and this triggers migration issues. And you can see that the big waves of migration that have kind of hit Europe from Africa can often be tied to ecological drivers. And again, this is something that we rarely hear about in the news. And another kind of thing, again, kind of things like the pandemic, their likelihood has tripled as a result of ecological collapse. So really this is just an illustration of kind of how a particular crisis, the ecological emergency, kind of cascades into other crises, such as the political crisis that we're facing with populist, xenophobic movements, kind of crises like around food security and rising food prices, cost of living. All these things interconnect within this context of the poly crisis, and the ecological emergency, in my mind, plays a central view in that. And as a result, if we keep going in the direction that we're heading, in the words of Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, we're really kind of making collective suicide pacts. This is really an imminent, extreme crisis that we're facing as a world, and we need radical thinking to address this. So how does this relate to economic thinking? Well, some of the drivers of these crises are the individualism that has been a mainstay part really of the last century of economic thinking. This individualism where we think about economic progress really as an increase in the aggregate benefits, and those benefits are no more than the sum of the well-being of individuals. And we can add it all up together. So the well-being gains, another £1 billion for Elon Musk in aggregate counts just as much as 1 billion people gaining $1. And this is, of course, a huge fallacy in terms of thinking of how we think about economic progress and economic welfare, which is grounded in this kind of equivocation of individual gains with social values, and not recognizing the difference that society is more than the parts of individuals. And similarly, that within all these kind of add-up sums, all values can be thought of as the same. We can just trade off between environmental issues, between culture, between basic kind of consumer preferences. And so if we lose on the environmental side, if we lose on the cultural side, if we lose in terms of social capital, social cohesion, etc., that all can just be compensated for by gaining an increase in consumer preferences, because we can add it all up by converting it into utility measured in terms of willingness to pay amounts of money. And again, this is just a fallacy of thinking that doesn't actually reflect how human well-being works and how people behave, and also what their broader sets of values are. And in doing so, we externalize what can't be exchanged. So what's not exchanged in markets, this can be the care, particularly by women and other people in communities, volunteering, the ecosystem services provided by natural ecosystems. All of this is very difficult to account for through conventional economic models. And Also then a focus on optimization, particularly in the short term, because we discount what happens in the future. And as a result of kind of creating optimized models, we focus on growth and efficiency, and this trumps equity, resilience, and long-term sustainability. We've had a fantastic example of how this harms the economy really in a broad sense, and not just in the thinking of maybe kind of enlightened people, but in kind of real term basic supply chains in the UK. So we've had, I think it's about 2 months ago, that there was a big hack with Jaguar Land Rover, one of the major car producers in the UK. And because Jaguar Land Rover works in terms of just-in-time supply chain, that whole kind of vehicle car supply chain in the UK is now completely at risk of collapse if there isn't going to be major government intervention similar to what's happening in the pandemic, because Jaguar Land Rover simply couldn't get address their IT hack in time to get production started again. Because those parts literally kind of come the day before they're needed, that whole kind of thousands of workers are at risk of losing their jobs, and a huge amount of economic value is at risk of being destroyed because of this focus on short-term optimization over resilience. And this is also related to trickle-down economics. When we kind of equate the benefits in society, when we equivocate the gains to the wealthy with the minimal gains to the poor, then kind of we can think of that idea that that somehow when rich people get better off, that trickles down. And again, we use kind of models in conventional economics that supposedly demonstrate this in theory, but because there is much kind of power happening in these markets that actually kind of focuses on maintaining those power relationships, maintaining monopolies, maintaining a set of narrow interests, rather than actually that kind of trickle down in reality. That consistently that actual trickling down happens much less than in conventional models is supposed. And of course, this leads to a much broader range of issues as well. And then within this, as we notice with this particular paper, there are massive intellectual lock-ins within the discipline of economics. The journals, all the main journals in economics, bar one, are led by North American editors, and with a little bit in London, a little bit in Switzerland. But it's an extremely kind of USA and Western concentration within a very limited number of economics departments and business schools. And of course, this gatekeeper effect is massive in terms of where funding goes to, in terms of what research agenda is followed. And then all of this has a political overlay. I know it's kind of one of Sandra's favorites quotes, to quote Margaret Thatcher: "There is no such thing as society." Again, that kind of new classical idea of that social values are an aggregation of individual values is translated from economic thinking, from economic modeling, into a whole kind of social perspective. And similarly, the market is inherently social. These kind of statements that kind of justify, essentially a kind of form of social individualism based on economic thinking. And that's based really on a coherent discourse that got promoted by the Mont Pelerin Society since the Second World War. A society led by Friedrich Hayek and other free enterprise economists whose main agenda was really to create political change to antagonize against socialism. And one of their key strategies was a conscious obfuscation in political and economic freedom. The idea that you couldn't separate the two, the idea that businesses should be able to do whatever they liked in the market with minimal restraint, this very kind of negative interpretation of what liberty means, that was essential for political freedom, and you could not tease it apart. That you could not take different kind of interpretations of liberty that were about what are people actually able to do? Are people actually able to participate? Are people able to actually meet their own needs? That's a very different interpretation of freedom that was not considered compatible with a politically free society. And so this ideological discourse has been used to justify laissez-faire policies, privatization, erosion of public services, and again, also justify inaction in the face of sustainability. And of course, losing that kind of competitive ideology that at least provided some kind of counterbalance to this thinking has exacerbated it. Is kind of this kind of arrogance of like, well, this is, we won, that dominated really for quite some time. But of course, we know all from Trumpism and its equivalents around the world that has really led to a massive backlash. That the people who have been left along the wayside, who didn't have anything trickled down back to them, they have antagonized against globalization. And so in my view, the current reactive kind of forces are direct response really to the political overlay, the neoliberal politicization of neoclassical economics. So there's a need for change. And kind of coming back to, for me, the kind of primacy of environmental thinking, because we live in a world that has living systems that form the foundation for everything else. It's a good idea to listen to environmental scientists and what do they actually say around what's needed in terms of changes to our economy. So this is a major paper in bioscience, which was accompanied by a kind of a scientific petition signed by 13,000 environmental scientists, many of the world's kind of leading ecologists among them. And they said that our goals for our economy need to shift from GDP growth and the pursuit of affluence towards sustaining ecosystems and improving human well-being by prioritizing basic needs and reducing inequality. So very much a shift from trying to grow the pie and trickling it down to trying to divide that pie more equally and making sure that that pie is really kind of based on living ecosystems. And so a wide variety of approaches have also been critical of neoclassical economics. Of course, you know that some are decades, even centuries old, some are much more recent. So when we talk about new economics as a kind of counterforce towards neoclassical, neoliberal thinking, we don't necessarily mean new in a sense of kind of a temporal, but new rather in the need for a new mainstream. There's a need for a different kind of economics to arise, a new way of thinking, a new way of challenging the political assumptions that have also been drawn from that old-fashioned economic thinking. And more recent discourses, they kind of perhaps more explicitly criticize mainstream economics as a barrier to addressing the climate and ecological emergency. So in global panels like the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you see these kind of discourses arising increasingly strongly in the past couple of years, perhaps the past decade, that really there is a much more fundamental shift necessary in economics to address those crises. And that seems to be kind of interacting now and kind of fusing with older things like social institutional economics, kind of approaches to provide that kind of whole system critique. But also mainstream economics itself is evolving. Things like complexity theory in evolutionary and complexity economics, things like a broader understanding of how people behave in behavioral economics, and things like the advent of circular economy, where there's a recognition that we cannot just have that kind of linear thinking around resource use. All of that is becoming very, very mainstream, and it's becoming kind of part of policy thinking. So we kind of recognize these kind of approaches as almost a kind of hybrid approach. They kind of internalize some of these ideas of new economics, whilst at the same time at the same time kind of being fairly anchored in the mainstream of neoclassical economics. And there's an argument there of kind of, are they evolving neoclassical economics, or is this the first steps in moving away from it? And these approaches do explicitly aspire to social transformation. That's kind of perhaps the difference with the more radical new economic approaches. Yet, this is something that's really deemed as necessary by things like IPCC, IPBES, Guterres, very increasingly the different UN institutes, and even the OECD and things like the World Economic Forum, that there needs to be a fundamental change in the attributes and institutions of human systems. Yet these more transformative approaches are still mostly outside the mainstream. And this is because of the vested interest and intellectual locking effects that we're kind of faced with. Corporate and institutional vested interests, government economic services. Sometimes, the exams to join as a government economist are really a kind of a bit of an ideological filter. And intellectual lock-ins within economics that I've already mentioned. So there's a need for cohesive challenge. We have all these different kinds of new economics. Some are older, some are more recent, some are more environmental and based in that discourse. Some are much more based in kind of traditional economic kind of issues. All these different economic approaches, they're diffuse. They don't really share a clear kind of discursive common platform like neoliberal economics did since the advent of the Montpellieran Society in 1947. And there is a need for that greater cohesion in order to build up discursive power and challenge that conventional paradigm, as well as providing an alternative to the kind of national conservative ideologies that are arising now. So this led us to start GANE, focusing on all these different crises, trying to convene experts, synthesize knowledge, and ultimately kind of starting to develop dialogues to catalyze action, and many different partners from science and practice involved in this. So we did a qualitative content analysis, and within our group had an expert deliberation of 237 narrative sources that featured 38 new economic approaches. We tried to understand their starting points and their cross-cutting narratives to establish a coherent, transformative new economics discourse. And many thanks to all the collaborators. I know Simone is in the audience right now. Of course, you've seen Kate and Sandra and many colleagues from around the world who've inputted into this, and also supported by the Lawes Foundation, the Leverhulme Center for Anthropocene Biodiversity, and the University of York in terms of funding. So these 38 approaches, really diverse, really broad, these more hybrid economic schools like behavioral and contextual economics, to the more radical economic schools like ecological, feminist economics. Also broader perspectives on economy like degrowth, post-growth, world system theory, the well-being economy, living economy, etc. And then broader social perspectives, almost kind of sets of worldviews like World Bon Vivir, Ubuntu, Simakause, which have important elements of economic thinking within them. And from all these approaches, we distilled 10 principles that we could find across them. These include a set of ecological principles, a set of political economy principles, a set of social principles, and a set of holistic principles that tie them all together. So in terms of holistic principles, there are socio-ecological embeddedness and holistic well-being, which is really about recognizing that economies are part of societies and societies are part of ecosystems, but also that economics really has a broader purpose to it. The purpose is to support human and planetary well-being. It's not just about kind of value-neutral arbitration of economic issues. Really, there's a normative purpose to how we design our economies and what we think is a good way to organize them and to flourish within them. And then secondly, interdisciplinarity and complexity thinking, acknowledging complexity and the need for interdisciplinarity in addressing economic problems. So these principles recognize how people and nature are interdependent, how economies are a subset of social and ecological systems, how socio-ecological systems constrain economic activity. It brings out questions, what's the economy actually for? It brings up questions around how we frame our methodologies. We want to integrate rather than ignore the socio-ecological contexts. We don't want to treat them as externalities. And as a result, there's the need for that greater interdisciplinarity, that there needs to be a much greater integration between economics and the broader environmental and social sciences and humanities. And we need to think about these interlinkages between economy, society, and ecology as complex systems, moving away from linear models. So an example of that is donut thinking as a very practical policy kind of approach, which considers both the kind of the social and ecological foundations, really, the social foundation, the ecological ceilings of the economy, where it finds a safe and just space to operate within. So again, this provides a normative foundation for economic thinking. Then there's ecological principles, limits to growth, limited substitutability of natural capital, and regenerative design. So ecological principles can be operationalized by thinking about planetary boundaries, like in the donut, by downscaling those to kind of work to the scale that we're thinking about, whether that's a city scale, a bioregion scale, a country scale, by local anchoring through participatory processes. Kind of how do we set sustainability goals in alignment with planetary boundaries within our bioregion, our city, etc. Through measures and indicators such as footprinting, and through evolution of methods like life cycle analysis to account for those kind of locally anchored downscaled planetary boundaries. There's a need for integration of the biophysical sciences into economics, building on those holistical principles, thinking about the societal metabolism. How does society use resources? What's the flow of energy through society? And how do we directly anchor kind of value-based thinking on this kind of biophysical footprint? And that has then implications for how do we design the economy? How do we move from linear resource flows to circular and regenerative design, and design institutions and incentives to avoid harm and link waste with inputs? Moving from ownership to use of goods, to not just kind of think about things in terms of efficiency, but again, working within that locally anchored kind of scale of planetary boundaries, and translating that also into community-based living infrastructures, thinking about the infrastructure, the physical capital that underpins our economies, by directly integrating it with natural capital, finding nature-based solutions that support security, stability, productivity, and allow local people, local communities to manage those capital assets. Also engendering nature connection and a sense of greater oneness with the environment, which in itself generates well-being. Social principles then, holistic perspectives of people and values, thinking about embedding pluralistic models of values and human behavior into economics. And equity, equality, and justice, considering them as central questions of economic inquiry, not just a kind of second place with efficiency at the top. So what does this mean? We need new models of human values and behavior. What does it actually mean to be a human being? Not that kind of that individualistic, utilitarian Homo economicus model, but really thinking more about models like Homo integralis, which actually, as far as I'm aware, comes from humanistic management and social care. Thinking about people in a relational way, sophisticated, culturally appropriate, realistic assumptions of values and behavior, surrounded, thinking about people's actual needs and wants rather than their theoretical utility trade-offs. So focusing on their lived experience. And I think that question of lived experience is really important in addressing that backlash from globalization, which has been so much about kind of abstract efficiencies rather than what's actually happening in communities and the frustration that leads people to. And then thinking about that broader concept of freedom, not just freedom from, freedom from regulation, but also freedom to what can we actually achieve as individuals? What can we achieve as a community? What are the capabilities that we have that can enable us to do that? And a policy of interventions focused on those needs and capabilities, making institutional meta values transparent. So what are the actual values that are embedded in the way that we design things like markets, design that are embedded in the way that we think about incentive systems, because often these meta values get in the way of addressing structural inequalities and power imbalances. And a key example of that is that institutions often have a very gendered nature that isn't necessarily transparent. And there's examples of that in the paper if you want to read up on that more. Political economy principles then, relationality and social enfranchisement, participation, deliberation, cooperation, and post-capitalism and decolonization. So again, what does that mean? Recognizing that empirical research always has normative dimensions, because there's always a social, institutional, and political context to what we research as economists. Repurposing business and financial systems based on socio-ecological embeddedness, building on those holistic principles. More integrated reporting and evaluation. And some of our team members have just started publishing some really interesting work on kind of 12 principles for that kind of holistic evaluation, similar to what we've done within GANE, but focusing on that field specifically. Emphasizing relational worldviews and values. Deliberative and participatory methods to resolve value conflicts as an alternative to these kind of optimization models, the need for social participation and deliberation. And rights of workers to do that within firms. Decolonization, post-capitalism, what does that actually mean? It means the unmaking of colonial and capitalist institutional configurations, like the post-colonial export of Western consumerism, but not replacing that with a single post-capitalist blueprint. So it's not just moving beyond capitalism, it's also moving beyond socialism in a sense. Embracing plural economic systems that are rooted in local and indigenous traditions, really providing that kind of agency to local communities to be able to design and enact their local economies. And that relates then to the foundational economy, empowering people to achieve economies that secure universal rights to basic services. There's also a recognition within new economics that traditional concepts of labor capital are increasingly inapplicable as a result of new technologies. And some of this is then linked to new practices, things like new currencies, new forms of cooperatives, new networking spaces, which allow local people in local communities to network with other local communities around the world and kind of barter directly with each other. That allows for new forms of communal ownership and cosmo-local approaches that connect the local and the global, as well as new analytical tools that maybe are more thought of as traditional economics. So for example, dynamic and ecological economic macro models, new monetary theory that can kind of back up this post-capitalist thinking. And there's many examples of that in things like post-Keynesian economics, ecological macroeconomics, and increasingly degrowth. So a lot of kind of things that I can put on the plate now, but if we just kind of want to summarize that in one diagram that Sandra actually put together with some help from AI, it can be summarized as that we're one, this kind of sense of holism, a oneness between people, but also between people and planet. A particular worldview that recognizes that oneness, the recognition of kind of the importance of equity and justice, our dependence on nature, and the importance of belonging in local communities, but also belonging through participation in economic systems, participation in political systems. So just very briefly then, and I'm hoping kind of Kate may give some more practical examples of this, but how do we achieve this transformation? So we've been talking about discursive power, and there's important opportunities there, opportunities for building discourse coalitions, these different new economic approaches, all 38 of them that we looked at. They are quite different from each other. They emphasize different principles, and they can really complement and strengthen each other and also learn from each other to build more sophisticated, more holistic, more integrated, stronger, more convincing discourses. We're in a polycrisis, and these crises open windows to change. There's also a growing interest in new economic models. There's many people in kind of policy organizations and businesses that are realizing that the status quo isn't really working for securing long-term benefits to citizens and also long-term value for businesses. And there's also an opportunity in challenging national conservative discourses. This is a term that I use kind of just to kind of pull together all these kind of reactionary populist ideas. If you look at them, they're full of internal contradictions and also contradictions geographically. it is relatively easy to to challenge in an intellectual sense, and by having a much more coherent, not so much kind of singular, but certainly cohesive new economic discourse, it can stand up as a much more credible, rigorous, also much more grounded alternative that is not just based on critique, but also in terms of a positive vision of what we want to achieve for people. But there's also massive barriers, the institutional inertia, the dominance of neoclassical discourses still within things like government economic services, some of the things we talked about with vested interest, intellectual lockings, etc. But also lack of visibility of transformative new economics approaches. Issues with the media are kind of course, massive in this. So strategic kind of targeting of how we can address some of these barriers and take advantage of opportunities. But I think also, if you ask me personally, what we're really trying to do here is creating the seeds for change. Change happens through cycles of disintegration and rebuilding, and I think there is a degree of disintegration happening in the world, and some of that may have to happen more before genuinely positive visions of what is possible can really take root. But at the same time, at the grassroots, there are so many new economic alternatives happening that I think we can take a lot of inspiration from that as well. And just a few references. So thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Jasper. I'm not going to share slides. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. Good morning, everybody. It's the end of our week and the end of our day here in the UK, but I know it's a bit earlier for you. Thanks for having us. I'm not going to spend long talking because I want us to have time for discussion, excuse me. But I want to sort of move on from thinking about the vast number of lock-ins that are built into current economic systems that are preventing us making the transformations that we need, and move on from thinking about what's wrong with neoliberalism, because I think we all know, and the question isn't whether it works, it's how we dismantle the systems that it built and how we replace them with something better. And so I want us to, be thinking about how the real world outcomes that we want to see are shaped by both technical choices and the narratives that go along with them. And the work that GANE has done, I think, is really helpful in grounding those narratives in a shared vision. And the work has implications for different arenas, really. So there are core implications of the work for policy and public institutions, I think. One of those is the need for us to move beyond siloed thinking within institutions and policy-making bodies. We need to be thinking about cross-issue coalitions. So joining up the thinking that happens around finance to the thinking that happens around the environment, to the thinking that happens around labor, to the thinking that happens around health. So examples of that might be sustainability or well-being embedded budgeting, like we saw in New Zealand with their well-being budget, or multi-year forward-looking risk assessments, policy experiments with built-in learning loops. So we need to be encouraging institutions that do policy to be thinking differently in those ways. That means we also need reformed metrics and dashboards. There is at the moment an expert group on beyond GDP working at UN level to think about how we build upon the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, where we go next. And I hope that they may be producing some recommendations fairly soon that may have some impact on national governments and international organizations about what gets measured, about replacing or complementing GDP with well-being measures, with resilience measures, with measures of ecological integrity and social cohesion indicators. And at the same time, at the moment, there is a G20 Commission on extreme wealth inequality, which is hoping that we might actually see an intergovernmental panel that would be looking at inequality issues. And if that can get joined up with the intergovernmental panel that thinks about climate change and the one that thinks about biodiversity, maybe we do start to get much more focus on reformed metrics and dashboards of what matters. We'll have to invest in data infrastructures that connect well-being, environmental sustainability, and financial stability, but that's not beyond the wit of man to sort out. And then lastly in there, I think we need to be thinking about precautionary and adaptive policy design. And I think this is where it helps that I come from public health and epidemiology. Precautionary principles are sort of built into our thinking. We need to be using scenario planning, stress tests for systems, and reflexive policy review mechanisms to think about what works. I know a lot of people here will be researchers and academics. What are the implications of GANE's work there? I think it is to encourage transdisciplinary research that integrates economics, ecology, anthropology, social psychology, and dare I say epidemiology, to surface the tacit assumptions within each of those disciplines and see where we can learn from one another. We clearly need to be involving communities and policymakers and practitioners early in our research design. We need to be publishing pathways of influence and decision points to help people think about how to translate research into action. And we need to create transparent governance around our data, our models, our assumptions, and embed uncertainty communication to policy advisories. And then how do we build these coalitions, these discourse coalitions to influence? How do we do collaboratively what the Montpellier lot managed to do so successfully all those years again and continue it? You know, we do need networks of actors who share sets of ideas and frame problems and solutions in complementary ways. And I think the work that we've done within GANE helps to create that network, because we are bringing diffused and different ideas about new economic thinking together and showing what the commonalities and the shared values and principles are. We need to align our narratives and leverage credible messages across sectors, and I mean businesses, civil society, science, faith communities, youth, etc. You could come up with your own lists. And then think about how these principles translate into language that mobilizes support without polarizing people. And that's tricky in our contemporary world, but we do need to be thinking about that. So what kind of coalition edges do we need? You know, we do need policies, we do need to talk about values, we do need to talk about evidence, but we do need to talk about storytelling as well, and think about which of those are most effective for particular audiences. I think what we need is a sort of shared narrative spine for all of this, and then we can all go off to our own disciplines and target audiences and individually focused work and take that shared narrative spine with us. You know, we need concise sets of claims about the polycrisis, the need for transformation, the role of well-being centered policy. Now, there are groups, alliances that are already doing much of this, so we don't need to reinvent wheels. There's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance doing great work. There is Earth for All, which developed within the Club of Rome. There's the Great Transitions Initiative and similar efforts. I bet lots of people on this call belong to one or more of those efforts and alliances, so we can be bringing those together and making sure that we're all working with that shared narrative spine, pushing these things forward. Because I want to keep time for our discussion, I'm just going to leave you with 6 potential pathways, actions that we could all be thinking about using. One is building integrative policy experiments, so proposing pilot programs that combine social protection with ecological restoration and resilient infrastructure with well-being metrics. The second is about rethinking metrics and reporting. That's the beyond GDP, genuine progress indicator kinds of things. The third is strengthening our cross-sector coalitions, and it means working at different scales, so cities, regions, nationally, internationally, to co-design policies and narratives, always including marginalized voices. Fourth is investing in capacity building and education. We need to be developing interdisciplinary training modules, public-facing materials to democratize the understanding of the polycrisis, the lock-ins, and the transformative principles. The fifth is using narrative strategy, using storytelling that connects people's everyday lived experiences with the systemic change that we need to see. And the last one is thinking about accountability and learning loops, establishing evaluation, feedback, and accountability mechanisms to learn from new policies, new ways of doing things with transparent failure analysis and iteration. So those are just some sort of pathways to action to leave you with. But I realize we're quite close to the top of the hour, and both Jasper and I have talked probably more than we intended to do. So I'm going to stop and hope that we have space to address some of the comments and the questions that I see are already in the chat.
Thank you, Kate. So you can, I'm going to call on a couple folks, but if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. So Magnus, you had a couple of questions or comments. I wonder if you can focus on one of them, maybe. You still here?
I'm here. Yes. Thanks, Sandra. So I'm really interested into, emerging forms of organizing and new organizations. And so I'm seeing both empirically and theoretically forms of organizing appearing. It's DAOs for short, as decentralized autonomous organizations, for those that are unfamiliar. And it seems to be like, it's exactly what we're talking about: circular economy, regenerative finance in practice. So I'm wondering what the more senior people in this room think about it, if they've heard the term, their initial thoughts and skepticism. Thank you.
Jasper, Kate, one of you want to take that?
Have you heard of DAOs, Kate? No,
I looked it up there while we were talking.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Um,
I don't know either, but I just was struck by your other comment, Magnus, which I really liked, which is that there's not just an externalization of kind of value and environment, but there's also an externalization of meaning. And I think you hit the nail on the head, really. And then this is where that kind of principle of relationality comes in, that the relationality brings meaning. And when you externalize relationality, that's when you externalize meaning.
So if I looked it up correctly, it's a decentralized autonomous organization, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's an acronym I've not come across before, so I don't feel I can really comment on it. But what I looked at briefly was, if we're talking about decentralization, then I think that's potentially helpful, but only if that is democratized in some way. Does that make sense as a response? Because I don't really know what they are.
I think that is exactly my understanding of them anyway. Ian, I see you nodding. Or you want to make a comment?
Yeah, hi Sandra, hi everybody. Yeah, DAOs are interesting things. I think they are decentralized, but they are also autonomous. So they're not top-down organizations. They have to find other ways of decision making and how they implement those decisions and use their resources and agreed upon it. It can get quite complex. Sandra will probably say after what I say next, well, Ian would say that, wouldn't he? But I spent a lot of time researching the concept of organization and organic systems and ways of looking at organizations as organic entities that actually evolve in line with their environment and stay connected to them, and become part of their environment, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but there is a very deep dive in how that might be obtained. And if you combine that thinking with decentralized autonomic organizations, I think there's a real way forward here, because I don't know whether Jane Goodall died recently, and on Netflix there's her famous last words, where she actually did an interview before she died, knowing that it would not be broadcast until after she died. And some of the insights she gives of what human activity is like on the planet, I found very interesting. It's on Netflix, it's free of charge. It's an interesting, and I found it an interesting and inspiring watch anyway, hearing her last words. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sandra, there you go. I'll be
Sure.
quiet.
I think we're seeing a lot of movement towards this. The idea of polycentric governance, I think, incorporates a lot of this action and voice coming up from local, and the idea of cosmo-localism, which decentralizes things down to local levels. So you're seeing various iterations of this type of thinking. And I think it's hard for people because it requires much more activism and probably more knowledge. But that's the direction. Ravi, do you want to ask one of your questions?
I just want to, my question is less important, but what started as in the dialogue is more interesting to me. So I just want to add one more angle to this distributed systems. One aspect is knowledge bridging to effective and efficient action. I think as we have more and more delegation and distribution of action at lower levels, there should be connections across these lower level entities so that this knowledge is delegated to the level of best knowledge. So that there is always the best knowledge flowing through the whole system. Even though when you delegate the authority to act, the best knowledge gets transferred across all these lower level entities. So that's a very important principle in trying to have autonomy and also distribution of authority down to lower levels. So there should always be bridging across these lower levels, which some of you people are already doing as the leading thought leaders. You're moving the knowledge across people who may not know the right knowledge. So conversations like this, I think, facilitate that. So my only point there is, as you lower the level of authority to act and make the lower level entities also autonomous, make sure that the knowledge is freely flowing across these lower level entities. Yeah,
Thanks,
that's
Ravi.
all. Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi. Joel, you want to ask your question?
Thank you. This was a comment that was a central point in a recent Journal of Sustainability article led by my colleague Gerard Frias, who's here today, and I actually want to speak to this. And it's consistent with, I think, the broader scope of the conversation today. It was just simply to have us notice that much of the conversations about the business case and triple bottom line applied to corporations or businesses, may really be at the wrong level of scope and thinking for their boundaries, that these issues of sustainability are much broader and more interconnected than apply to any corporation. Gerard, do you want to comment on this?
Joel, you have it. Go ahead. I think the one of the okay, I'll comment on it because I can't resist it. One of the challenges, at least that I'm seeing, and I think I saw some of that in the idea of the Tao, etc., is I keep asking this question: do we have time? And I think, given the state of the crisis and the polycrisis in the world, and where we are today, and where all the indicators are headed, I'm just getting personally frustrated that we're still operating so much at an intellectual level rather than being out in the field. It's great to have these conversations, and I'm here, but that groundwork that's necessary, that's at scale, scope, and urgency, is clearly not in proportion to the challenges we have today. So I think that's my source of frustration in many of these conversations. When I do talk about this in many different forums, everybody listens, and then everybody goes back to business as usual. I think we have to get out of our ivory towers and be out in the field.
Thanks, Gerard. Charles Savage, are you here? Would you like to share a comment? And then Noah?
Yes.
Noah and Marty, if you could make them relatively quick since we only have 4 minutes.
Okay. We focus on well-being. Where does wisdom and our wisdom abilities come, and how can we awaken them?
Kate, Jasper?
For me, well-being is an extremely comprehensive and holistic kind of construct, and would include wisdom in there. And I think about well-being as a societal construct and not as an individual one. So it can contain wisdom and wisdoms indeed from different sources within it. So I think of well-being much more like the Bhutanese think of happiness as multifaceted and occurring in different parts of society.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you. Could I just say, rather than happiness, joy could be an even more powerful understanding. And if we go back to the Sanskrit notion of Ananda, Chit, Sat, as we know, the joy of life, the way we talk to one another, enriches our common life.
Thank you, Charles. Let's see. I don't know who came first, Marty or Noah. Marty?
Well, my concern is a little bit along with Gerald Farias, because some of this presentation is extremely abstract, very understandable by those of us that have had a higher education. My concern, after having taught in university for many years, is many of the young people since COVID are not interested in going to university. They're interested in personal experience, and they read social media. So I think Jasper and Kate and those on this committee, you need to understand, if you want to affect young people today and the growth of this, you need to reach out into these modalities and not just do it through a university structure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, we certainly don't only do academic papers. I can speak for Jasper and myself. You know, we both are out there in the field in multiple scales, multiple locations as well, and using different modalities to communicate with people that include videos, social media, etc. And I know that there's about to be a forthcoming video competition that is being sponsored, I think, by Earth for All, along with the GTI, to a competition for filmmakers to create ways to communicate these kinds of things much more widely. But we do need to do these academic discourses as well. So, but we don't only do them.
Yeah, I know Michael Pearson has been very much involved in creating videos too. So, and we are working on so the figure that Jasper showed at the end is part of a translation into everyday terms of these principles that we hope to be working on in the future. Noah, you get the last question. Can you make it quick? Noah, are you there still? I see his name, but he's
Can I just say something in response to the last couple of questions, Sandra? I think that you know, I didn't become an academic until later in life. Until my early 30s, I was a campaigner, kind of environmental, social justice, etc. But what I found was, you know, we're trying to change things in the field, but there's no cohesive, clear, overarching, connecting narrative that pulls it together. So there is so many initiatives, both from bottom up, but also, in policy and analysts, people like Kate and myself work with. And there's so much kind of good intention, and there's so much frustration with some of the other kind of discourses that are gaining now. And there is a heartfelt need for something which connects it. And I think that's what we're trying to do here, really. And absolutely, this talk today was for an audience that is here right now, that understands terms like, you're more sophisticated than us. So we hadn't even heard of the term DAO. We're being educated by you in a way. But this is really what we want to do with GANE in our next steps, is have those dialogues with broader civil society, have these public dialogues, look at actually if we translate these principles in more basic terms, more understandable terms, not more basic. How much public support is there for this narrative? Because I think we kind of get a sense that it's actually quite high. And if we can get that kind of evidence then to decision makers, then again, it provides another vector for pulling together all these bottom-up activities with the more top-down intention to make things, to change the world for a better place. So really, that's what our kind of strategy is. And I completely empathize with everybody in the chat who's raising, like, how much time is there for this? And we don't know, but we know it's not that much. But at the same time, we also know that change happens through disintegration and reintegration. And that's something also, with that question of wisdom, that's something that we also have to surrender to, in a sense. We can't control everything. And we can't force ourselves to be on time with a time scale that we don't actually know that well. So for me, that's the shamanic part.
Yeah, thank you, Jasper. And Kate, do you want to have any final word? And thank you both for joining us today.
No, I think that was a good final word from Jasper, actually. I think, I would agree that we have learned by being in this session. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And we all go forwards with what time we have, don't we? What skills we have to the communities we can reach and do the best we can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Marty and Gerard's and points. And, some of us have skills in certain areas and others don't. And we do need to reach across many aisles. And that's what I think the original intent of GANE was to do. And obviously, hopefully, it's an ongoing project. So thank you all for coming. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us.